thank you, Tom, and David, of course, for inviting me to give this talk about the Sephardic Jewish community in London in the 18th century. The talk is based on my dissertation for the master's degree that Tom mentioned, which I completed at the Open University earlier this year, and it has exactly the same title, which is Keeping the Faithful. So I'm now going to share my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see some nice trees here now. And in a minute, you should be able to see the actual presentation. Yes. Is that everybody see that? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So the drawing you see here is by Thomas Rowlandson from around 1800, and it's of the Rag Fair on Rosemary Lane in the East End of London. The Rag Fair was an old clothes market dominated for much of that period by Jews. And they're depicted in this drawing in a very stereotypical and sometimes derogatory way that was common in that area. So we see allusions to fencing stolen goods, coining, sellers wearing hats piled on top of each other. You can see the chap here on the right next to the woman in red with lots of hats on top of each other. But our story actually starts a little further east along the Mile End Road. Now, some of you will be familiar with this, I guess, historical curiosity, which is tucked away behind the 1970s blocks of Queen Mary University on the Mile End Road. But for those that aren't, this is what's left of the Novo or New Cemetery of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews Congregation of London. Actually not so new. The Novo was consecrated in 1733 to replace the Viejo or Old Cemetery just down the road, which had reached capacity. And here's the Old Cemetery in green on the bottom left, and the Novo just up the road in pink. Now, the Novo once occupied a site that was perhaps 5 times the size of what is left. But in 1974, the synagogue sold most of the ground to Queen Mary University, which was looking to expand. And unfortunately, most of the stones were smashed, and the remains of around 7,000 deceased dug up and reburied in West London. And I think it's fair to say that it's a decision that still rankles in the community. The small number of gravestones that remain behind Queen Mary date from after the mid-19th century. Unlike their counterparts in Ashkenazic cemeteries, the stones of Sephardic Jews, as you'll know, lie flat on the ground. All are equal under heaven. But in life, some were more equal than others. And this talk is going to be about these two groups, the 40% or so of Sephardic Jews whose synagogal taxes and donations funded the 60% who were in receipt of some form of poor relief, and how, despite this totally voluntary arrangement, by which I mean lacking any powers of government, the congregation managed to maintain its unity, its cohesion. The quantitative analysis and data for the research that underlies this talk spans a 35-year period, from 1767 to 1802. And the reason it begins in 1767 is this is when the congregation started registering both male and female births. And 1802 is both a convenient 35-year gap and a significant date in itself that I'll come to shortly. However, I will be erecting some scaffolding starting earlier in the 18th century through to the early part of the 19th century. First, some background. I'm sure many of you know this already, but worth going through it again. So the London Sephardic congregation was founded by a small group of Portuguese merchants, about 40 families in total. who were descendants of Jews who'd been forcibly converted to Catholicism in Portugal after 1497. They were the so-called New Christians, also known as conversos, who'd outwardly been living as Catholics, but who openly re-embraced their ancestral faith after Cromwell readmitted the Jews in 1656. This painting is a modern reimagining of the original house cum synagogue on Church Lane in the city. Sephardic, the word Sephardic derives from the Hebrew name for Spain, Sepharad. The London congregation is commonly referred to as belonging to the Western Sephardic diaspora. This took shape in the 17th and 18th centuries and was made up mostly of Portuguese Jews. Their immigration routes can be seen in the black lines, sort of towards the left of the picture, to France, Northern Europe, and the Americas. The earlier Eastern diaspora was formed by Jews expelled from Spain in 1492 and who made their way to North Africa, the Italian peninsula, and the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, it's a little bit of a simplification, and you've probably seen this map many times before, but it's not, not too wrong. In time, the London congregation came to be known as Bevis Marks, after the street on which the community's synagogue was inaugurated in 1701. The community grew with the influx of refugees from the Portuguese and Spanish Inquisitions in the first half of the 18th century, and once this had tailed off, with immigrants from Holland, Italy, and North Africa. From the mid-1700s into the 19th century, it reached a steady population of around 2,000 individuals in what I've determined is about 630 households. So not an insubstantial number. Bearing in mind, for example, that the Amsterdam community at its peak was around 3,000 people, maybe a little bit more. Geographically, the community was centered around the so-called Jewish East End. By matching synagogal tax or finta lists to land tax records and wills, I was able to analyze the residence of fee-paying members during the research period. So I found that just under 87% lived within a 1-mile radius of Bevis Marks, primarily in the City of London wards of Aldgate and Portsoken, and in the extramural parish, so outside the city walls, of St. Mary Whitechapel. It's difficult to perform a similar kind of analysis for the poor of the community because records of residents are lacking, really. But scholars have identified the eastern fringes of the city, Houndsditch, Spitalfields, Whitechapel, and Mile End Old Town outside it, all again within roughly 1 mile of Bevis Marks as areas where poorer Jews, both Sephardim and Ashkenazim, lived. From its inception, the London community operated autonomously. Now, Jewish autonomy is a well understood concept. In the Ottoman Empire, Italy, and Germany, Jewish communities ran their own affairs, juridically empowered by the local authorities, whether central or municipal, to administer a wide range of functions. The position of Bevis Marks in England, and also Amsterdam, it has to be said, was somewhat different. The congregation's lay executive was the Mahamad, kind of equivalent to the wardens of a parish church, but also a lot more powerful because it was all centralized in one place. It functioned occasionally as a court of arbitration, settling disputes over debt and family fallouts. But again, this was entirely voluntary. It had no formal jurisdiction to do so. And the Mahamad's decisions were not binding on the parties, who could also turn to the civil courts of the realm, and often did. Similarly, the congregation also ran its own welfare system independently of the old poor law, but this too was entirely voluntary. And I should just point out that the old poor law was a body of laws that started to come together in the Elizabethan period, and by this time had kind of developed into a more settled thing, and it was administered on a parish by parish basis by vestries, parish vestries of the Church of England. So some of the recipients of relief from the congregation's welfare fund, the Sadaqah, could turn to the parish for relief under the Old Poor Law, but as I will later explain, hardly any did. From the 1720s, the congregation came under immense strain from increased immigration. To start with, these were often penniless refugees from the Inquisition in Portugal, which was still burning so-called Judaizers at the stake. Others had all their assets seized and exiled to distant towns and cities, so many decided to leave and make their way to centers like Amsterdam and London, where they were welcomed with open arms. But by the mid-1740s, immigration from the Iberian Peninsula had largely died down. Not completely, but it had really tailed off. Now there were further waves of less welcome economic migrants from Italy, North Africa, and to a smaller extent, the Ottoman lands. And to deal with the strain on the congregation's welfare budget, a fundamental change in the philosophy behind the system was needed and had to be effected. So at the center of the system was the Sadaqah Fund, administered by the synagogue's lay leadership, the Mahamad, and the elders, the Velhos. Tzedakah reflects the way Jews of Iberian origin pronounce the Hebrew word tzedakah, which literally translates as justice or righteousness, but is commonly used to signify simply charity. The operation of the tzedakah during the congregation's first century reflected the rabbinical understanding of charity as righteous behavior for the giver and of justice and a right due to the recipient. And here, that is expressed in a sermon delivered by David Nieto, the Haham, or rabbi of Bevis Marks, in 1709, where he declared, "It is natural for the wealthy to give, and it is natural for the poor to receive." It was a conception that would come under increasing strain during the second half of the 18th century from the immigration I've mentioned, which the congregation's leadership, lacking the powers of either central or local government, couldn't prevent. At the same time, the leadership would have been aware of and influenced by a vigorous debate going on around them in wider English society since at least the 1720s about how to deal with the problem of the poor. In 1740, the elders voted down a proposal to restrict the tzedakah to a much narrower group than they previously had. And this narrower group consisted of widows, orphans, and the elderly. But it appears the elders balked at such a fundamental reinterpretation of the principles of Jewish charity, and it would be another 9 years before the matter came before them again. And when it did, legitimation came from a surprising quarter. That was this chap, Isaac de Pinto, a wealthy financier, philosopher, and writer on economics. Although he was mostly associated with the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, de Pinto also spent time in England, where he had extensive dealings with the British government, financing government debt. De Pinto wrote mostly on finance and economics, but he was also the author of a single socio-economic treatise, which he wrote in 1748, while serving as the treasurer of the Amsterdam congregation, the Gabbai. This treatise was entitled Reflexiones Politicas, Political Reflections, and it analyzed conditions that had led to increased poverty among Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam and the measures needed to reverse the trend. Challenging the assumption that Jewish paupers were entitled to relief from the Portuguese community as a right, de Pinto lamented, "Why are we obliged to support the weak from all over the world? What would happen if the doors were opened here in Amsterdam to poor Protestants from Europe, Africa, and Asia? Would that act, though apparently a charitable one, not seem ridiculous, ruinous, and even impossible?" Instead, de Pinto proposed a series of radical measures, denying payments to new immigrants, barring newly married couples from claiming relief for 3 years, and assisting poor Sephardic families. De Pinto suggested a third of the total to emigrate to the Dutch and British colonies in the Americas. The idea behind this would be to reduce the burden on the community's coffers and give such families a chance to escape poverty. De Pinto's treatise has not received much attention from scholars, and where it has, this has been in the context of the Amsterdam community. Its impact on the London community has been overlooked. Although never a member of Bevis Marks, de Pinto must have been a familiar figure there on his visits and would have been on intimate terms with the leaders of the congregation, who, in their eyes, he was one of us, not a rabbi or a religious judge, who were ultimately employees of the synagogue, but a wealthy financier who had the ear of princes and kings. To be clear, the congregation's leaders were spurred into reform by the rising burden of supporting the poor, exacerbated by the influx of poor Sephardic immigrants. There is, however, circumstantial but strong evidence that Reflexiones Politicas gave the leaders of the London community the philosophical validation to change the way they dealt with the poor. The first reform was announced on the 30th of October 1748, not long after the publication of de Pinto's treatise, when the elders resolved, in order to discourage the poor who come from abroad, to restrict tzedakah payments to those who had been resident in this kingdom for 7 years in a row. This was later reduced to 5, with the only exception being for direct arrivals from Portugal or Spain, which, as I've mentioned, had by this time had become almost negligible. The new policy coincided with growing fears in the wider society in the country about vagrancy and crime, following the demobilization of soldiers and sailors at the end of the Austrian War of Succession in late 1748. The leaders of the congregation were probably influenced by this climate, or saw it as an opportunity to impose the restrictions they'd felt unable to implement before. The second major change came 6 months later, in May 1749. The elders ordained that allowances to those already receiving relief would remain unchanged, but would be phased out as the recipients died, so natural attrition. Regular weekly or monthly payments to new applicants, however, would be made only to the elderly, the sick, and the disabled, children and widows of synagogue officials, and families coming directly from Portugal or Spain, but only for the first 2 years of their residence in London. Everyone else, the able-bodied poor, who they now called strugglers, would be entitled to casual payments only, and that on merit. Around the same time, the congregation set up 2 subscription charities, Bet Holim, House of the Sick, in 1748, and in 1749, Mahasim Tobim, Good Works, funding pauper apprenticeships and extending microloans to strugglers to buy stock or tools for their trade. Both of these subscription charities, both in their model and institutions themselves, emulated existing English equivalents. In short, a paradigm shift had come about from a traditionally Jewish understanding of universal charity to one of targeted philanthropy, seeking to address the causes of poverty, or the causes of poverty as they saw them, with an Anglo-Protestant emphasis on industriousness and morality. A major revision to the Constitution, the Ascamot in 1781, would make the link to morality even more explicit. It forbade the elders and the Mahamad from admitting to their tzedakah lists any person or family whatsoever who shall not be worthy thereof, both in regard to their good conduct and their necessities. In this way, the convergence of Jewish charity and Anglo-Protestant philanthropy was complete. I commented earlier that Bevis Marks' welfare system was a voluntary one that did not enjoy any powers conferred by law. Yet, when an opportunity arose to put the system on a statutory footing, the leaders of the congregation turned it down. Why? Well, that opportunity was the Colquhoun Van Oven scheme. The authors of the scheme were Dr. Joshua Van Oven, seen here on the left, who was a surgeon to the poor of the Ashkenazi Great Synagogue, one of the 3 Ashkenazi synagogues of the far more numerous Ashkenazim, and Patrick Colquhoun, at the time a metropolitan magistrate and collaborator of the social reformer Jeremy Bentham. Between 1801 and 1802, Van Oven and Colquhoun devised a scheme to address the perceived high levels of criminality amongst the Jewish poor in London. The scheme was to be introduced via a parliamentary bill and envisaged the creation of a quasi-governmental body that would take over all matters relating to the Jewish poor in London. It would be administered by representatives of all 4 synagogues, 3 Ashkenazi and 1 Sephardic, in that proportion. And it would be financed by a centralized fund, bringing together all the compulsory synagogal taxes, voluntary contributions, as well as an appropriation of 1/2 of the poor rates paid by Jews to their parishes of residence. This is the poor tax, poor law tax. This last source of finance was later dropped from the plan, as Van Oven feared it would stir hostility towards Jews amongst non-Jewish ratepayers, who might also have to be reassessed for the parishes to make up the deficit. Bevis Marks opposed the scheme from very early on. On 14th February 1802, the elders met and rejected the involvement of their synagogue by 26 votes to 1, pretty decisive, declaring somewhat haughtily that they did not consider themselves justified at present in any wise altering their own political or economical system, which has for upwards of a century past answered every purpose of its institution. As a result of the opposition of Bevis Marks, Colquhoun and Van Oven reformulated their plan to encompass the Ashkenazi poor only. I beg pardon. And in the end, a brief petition was submitted to Parliament, but it never went further than that. The Colquhoun-Van Oven scheme was effectively stillborn. So why did Bevis Marks object to a scheme that would have put relief of the Jewish poor on a legislative footing? Historian Todd Endelman has noted that the Sephardim were a wealthier body than the Ashkenazim in general, and would consequently be forced to contribute a disproportionate amount of the funds to support the project, especially since the Sephardic poor was such a small percentage of the total Jewish poor. According to another historian, Mordecai Rozin, the leaders of Bevis Marks saw the plan as an intention to use their funds for encouraging Ashkenazic immigration from Europe. The Sephardic leadership surmised, probably correctly, that putting their finances in the hands of a statutory body in which they were a minority would spell the end of their financial autonomy, if not the very existence of the congregation as a separate political body. But could the leaders of Bevis Marks, in fact, have been in denial about the scale and nature of the poverty problem in their own community? The Sephardic poor are defined here as those who were at any point in receipt of some form of relief, whether that was a regular pension or casual handouts. This is how the congregation's leaders defined those in poverty, and how the poor, through petitioning for relief, defined themselves. So obviously what is captured here is relative poverty, although many will also have been in absolute poverty. Throughout the 18th century, portrayals of Jews generally were stereotypical, epitomized by mall hackabouts, wealthy, no doubt Sephardic protector in William Hogarth's A Harlot's Progress. And the peddler of trinkets you see in the center of the picture on the right, and again in Hogarth's Canvassing of Votes. Nothing much lay between. The dominant image of a Jew was of an itinerant old clothes seller, probably engaged in criminal behavior, although those tended to attach more to Ashkenazic Jews, this perception. The Prussian author of a contemporary travelogue remarked of the Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews of London, "All the children of Israel who are obliged to quit Holland and Germany take refuge in England, where they live by roguery. If they themselves do not steal, they at least help to conceal and to dispose of the plunder. They are therefore so much hated in England that the honesty of their Portuguese brethren cannot weaken the unfavorable impression which such a bandit of robbers has occasioned." So not much prejudice there. Even Patrick Colquhoun, the Metropolitan Police Magistrate we met earlier, was not immune to such misconceptions. In his treatise in 1800 on policing in the capital, Colquhoun wrote that members of the Portuguese synagogue, being mostly wealthy, are extremely attentive to their poor, among whom there is said not to be a single beggar or itinerant. In reality, being far less populous than their Ashkenazic counterparts, the Sephardic poor, which did include beggars and vagrants, as well as artisans, apprentices, and shopkeepers, were simply less visible. As this simple pie chart shows, around 40% of households where the head paid the synagogue tax, known as finta, supported the 61% of households who received some form of relief. And as a proxy for this category of relief recipients, I've used the number of families that received free masot, or unleavened flatbread, during Passover. The wealthy had to pay for their masot. Let's compare this with the Christian parish poor relieved under the old poor law. The scholars behind the London Lives project have calculated that between 1762 and 1790, the relatively wealthy city parish of St. Dionis Backchurch paid substantial pensions to just under 80 paupers out of a population of just under 80 people, or 10%. This compares to an average between 1767 and 1790 of 194 heads of households out of 621 in receipt of either a velhos or a mahamat pension, i.e. 31%. That's over 3 times the figure for St. Dionis Backchurch. Now, you may say that St. Dionis was not representative of the national picture or even of London. The London Lives Project has calculated that in the year ending at Easter 1803, at least 8% of the population of the capital were in receipt of some form of regular or casual relief. This compares to 63% of the London Sephardic community in 1802. 8%, 63%. For the crisis year of 1796, historian Thomas Sokol used a listing of households in Ardleigh, Essex, to demonstrate that 41% were pauperized. This is still only 2/3 as large as the 62% of pauperized households in the Sephardic community in 1796 as well. In conclusion, poverty in the Sephardic community was extensive and endemic throughout the period. The proportion of Sephardim receiving regular or casual relief over the period was of the order of 60%, which is 6 to 7.5 times as many as the 8 to 10% of the parish paupers in comparable categories in the capital. But what about the causes of poverty? Some of the causes of poverty in the community were unique to Jews. For example, they were restricted from joining livery companies and therefore not allowed to engage in retail trade within the city walls. Some Jews kept shop in the city by purporting to be wholesalers or taking advantage of loose enforcement by the city authorities. But far easier for those with the means was to open a shop in an extramural parish like Whitechapel. The larger number of those who did not have the means had to ply their trades as itinerant hawkers or peddlers wherever they could. The profile of the Sephardic community as an overwhelmingly immigrant one also affected the ability to earn a living in London. In my research, I found that as late as 1793, only 53 of the 401 households, 13%, receiving relief were headed by men or women born in London. In other words, 87% were immigrant households, and most of those from non-English speaking lands. It's hard to come by reliable figures for the distribution of occupations in the Sephardic community during this period. However, clues can be found in the Bevis Marks Aliens Register of 1803, which was compiled by the synagogue at the request of the authorities. Out of 141 names, a dozen declared clerical occupations. 18 were tradesmen and artisans, which included things like butcher, confectioner, jeweler, silversmith, perfumer, tailor, tobacconist, cap maker, manufacturer, garter maker, leather maker, slipper maker, silk thrower, and watch string maker. 3 were laborers, 8 were merchants, and 16 gave no occupation. The other category comprises 2 students, 2 employees of the synagogue, and 1 female servant to one of the employees of the synagogue. But the largest category, at nearly 42%, consisted of pensioners and women described by their marital status: spinster, widow, wife of, etc. Another large category was dealers in clothes, slippers, spices, china and glass, hardware, and general goods. These were mostly street sellers, i.e. peddlers. And you also had 3 people who described themselves as rhubarb vendors. The drawing shows a Jewish rhubarb seller in the city dressed in so-called Turkish garb, slippers, robe, and turban, as that was deemed exotic. But in fact, these rhubarb sellers were all Sephardic Jews from Morocco who had cornered that particular market. The list encompasses a narrow range of trades and occupations traditionally associated with the Jewish communities of London. Todd Endelman has again argued that for most Jews, it was the unstable character of the trades they followed, where a single stroke of bad luck could decimate savings, such as having your tray of trinkets stolen. And this was a crucial element in the transmission of poverty from generation to generation. The lack of training in any specialized calling also made it difficult for Jews to obtain the kind of employment that provided a steady income. This was precisely the point made by one Jacob Abanatar Pimentel, an elder of the congregation, when he wrote in a letter to the elders in December 1794, "With what article can our poor supply you? With cane strings, barley sugar, and sweet cakes. A mechanic is scarcely to be found, and few Jewish servants, but what are of German extraction." I should point out that this is not Mr. Pimentel in the portrait, but an unidentified gentleman by an unknown artist in the collection of the Samuel Johnson Birthplace Museum. But, I imagine that Mr. Pimentel could have looked a bit like this. Endelman has pointed out that 2 of the most common escape routes from poverty, artisanal training and education, were largely blocked for the Jewish poor. This wasn't unique to them. In common with the Gentile poor, most families could not afford more than a few years of education for their children before they had to be put to work. And equally, they could not meet the expense of having them apprenticed. You had to pay to apprentice your sons. To illustrate the challenges of poverty in the Sephardic community, I'm going to use a case study of one Joseph Uzili. For much of his life, Joseph was a struggler, one of the able-bodied poor who were only eligible for casual relief on merit. Historian Julia Lieberman has traced the first mention of Uzili to 1760, when, as a youth of about 14, he appears in the minutes of Mahasim Tobim, or Good Works, one of the congregation's subscriptions charities, as a pauper apprentice to become a shoemaker. That apprenticeship didn't work out for Joseph, and he appears to have fallen out with his master. From around 1767, his name begins to appear in the minutes of the Mahamad as a struggler, in other words, one of the able-bodied poor. Bevis Marks' annual accounts indicate that Joseph received casual relief as a struggler more or less continuously from 1767 until 1771, when he did something very unusual. On 13th November of that year, 1771, he turned up at a meeting of the Mahamad with twins aged 2 in tow, demanding to be put on the permanent Mahamad roll for relief. The minutes record that he was insolente, insolent. When he was refused, Uzili filed a complaint that caused the president of the Mahamad and his deputy to be summoned before the Lord Mayor's court to explain why. On the 31st of October, 1771, the Mahamad commissioned legal opinions from 2 of the most eminent jurists of the kingdom. In other words, they took this complaint quite seriously. These 2 jurists were John Dunning, who stepped down as Solicitor General the previous year, and Edward Thurlow, Attorney General since January 1771, and a future Lord Chancellor. The synagogue's brief to the 2 jurists described Joseph as an idle person capable of earning his living. In their opinions, in turn, Dunning and Thurlow stated that the congregation's system of poor relief, funded by a tax on wealthier members, was entirely voluntary and that it had no legal obligation to relieve Fuseli. Moreover, there was nothing hindering him from applying for relief to his unknown parish of settlement, which they stressed did have a legal obligation towards paupers of all faiths, not just Christians. Unsurprisingly, the Lord Mayor's Court threw out Joseph Fuseli's appeal. As is often the way, we never hear his voice in any of this, only those of the elites who are judging him. But his temerity in challenging the Mahamad earned Joseph lasting notoriety, both in his lifetime and beyond. 100 years later, the traveler and antiquarian historian of Anglo-Jewry, James Picciotto, would describe Fuseli as an incorrigible vagabond. This was clearly not a first-hand impression, it was 100 years later, but was it any less biased than the contemporary description of him as an idle person? The record shows that by the time of his dispute with the Mahamad in 1771, Joseph was married, and he and his wife Esther had a 4-year-old and twins aged 2. Esther was more or less continuously pregnant, giving birth to at least 14 children, only 5 of whom survived past the age of 12, until her own death in September 1782, apparently in childbirth. These were the classic conditions of young family life cycle poverty, where the oldest children are not yet working or old enough to look after the youngest to allow the wife to work, or where the wife is pregnant or nursing and cannot work. So Joseph Fuseli may or may not have been an idle person in character or even an incorrigible vagabond, but the family were certainly in need. This chart shows that households with children under the age of 5 receiving casual relief represented between 17.4 and 26% of all strugglers. So these were the people in life cycle poverty. The year 1795, where the figure was 22%, is interesting, as this was the peak of the subsistence crisis that gripped the whole country. If the Mahamad had recognized struggler households with small children as a special need category, especially during a subsistence crisis, one would have expected the figure at end 1795 to be much higher. But it's not surprising that it wasn't, or that they didn't recognize this, as life cycle poverty was not properly identified as a potential cause of poverty until 1901, when the Seabohm Rowntree wrote his paper on the subject. Joseph Fuseli's desire to join the Mahamad roll was understandable. The difference between relief levels on the Mahamad roll with that on the strugglers roll was substantial, as you can see in this graph, about 7 to 8 times as much. The chart shows the average relief per recipient in the 2 categories. Strugglers are the blue line at the bottom, and Mahamad roll pensioners the red line. However, the Mahamad were inflexible in applying the rules. As an able-bodied person, Fuseli was only entitled to casual relief, and he'd have to find his own means to eke out an existence. A strand of scholarship on poverty and welfare in the long 18th century has focused on the so-called economy of makeshifts. This refers to the various strategies that paupers employed to make ends meet, leveraging kinship and neighborly support networks, but also things like crime, prostitution, and begging. Many of these stratagems can also be seen among the Sephardic poor in London. Let's look at the strategies regarding kinship networks. Some extended families in the community were very large, providing kinship networks of potential support, but Joseph Fuseli's wider family was relatively small, consisting of his father, David, his mother, Hannah, and 1 brother, Mordecai. Yet, there is evidence of family solidarity. The records of Maas in Tobim show that the father, David, put up his own monthly tzedakah allowance, so David was on the Mahamad roll, as collateral for 3 small loans to Joseph in 1766, 1772, and 1775. The charity provided these interest-free loans to strugglers to help them buy stock or tools for their trade. but paupers could have different ideas. Already in 1767, the treasurer of Maas im Tobin was complaining that the poor were misusing the loans as a makeshift. Few are the poor who want to work, yet the money we lend them is spent on food instead of being put to use for tools and supplies. Little they must repay us monthly, they take out of their mouth. Therefore, what we do on their behalf seems of little use to them. Another tool of social control at the disposal of the Mahamad and in the economy of makeshifts for paupers was assisted emigration, the allowance called despacho. Would-be emigrants to the American colonies received the equivalent of 3 years' assistance, while despacho for destinations in Europe with Sephardic communities was 1 year's assistance. This was a calculated gamble for the Mahamad that it would be cheaper over the long term to pay paupers to go away than to maintain them in an open-ended arrangement. The minutes of the Mahamad revealed that in April 1772, Joseph Useley received despacho of £2 and 2 shillings to take his family by the road when he's ready to leave to an unnamed European destination, which I think is probably Italy. Yet Joseph does not appear to have kept his side of the bargain, pocketing the despacho, even though he did not travel. Yet another example of the economy of makeshifts in action. In later years, the Mahamad would seek to punish such failure to emigrate. For example, in the 1781 revision of the Askemat, it dictated that if any person or family receiving despacho did not emigrate, or having emigrated returned, they would be barred from relief for 3 to 10 years, depending on the amount of despacho that they had received. Another revision introduced by the rule changes of 1781 explicitly excluded anyone from benefits if they'd summoned the Mahamad or the elders before any magistrate or court of justice to complain of failure to answer his petition or grant the charity he required, or any other complaint against our government. In fact, precisely what Useley had done in 1771, 10 years earlier. Yet, the records show that in August 1783, Joseph did just that again. Once again, the Useley family's history tells a story of life cycle hardship. Joseph's wife Esther had died 11 months earlier in childbirth, leaving him with 3 children, the youngest 3 and the oldest 14. His father, whose tzedakah allowance underwrote loans to Joseph, as you recall, had also died in 1782. The Mahamad and the Lord Mayor were even less sympathetic than on the previous occasion, and Joseph was refused in a humiliating performance made to apologize publicly before the entire congregation. Joseph would remarry in 1785 and have 3 more children with his second wife, Rachel, continuing to receive casual relief at least once a year until 1789, and then for 11 more years between 1791 and 1802. Long spells like this on the strugglers' roll were not unusual. I've not tracked Joseph Useley's life course beyond 1802, but the records indicate that he died in 1810, leaving behind Rachel as a widow and 3 out of 17 children from 2 marriages who had somehow successfully survived into adulthood. So why didn't Joseph petition his parish settlement for relief? It turns out hardly any Sephardic Jews did. Few parish pauper records for areas of London where Sephardim lived alongside the wider population have survived. And so it's very difficult to test the perception that was very common at the time that Bevis Marks looked after its own. But fortuitously, St. Botolph Aldgate is one where they have. A review of over 6,300 settlement and bastardy examinations of the parish between 1767 and 1799 do not throw up any positively identifiable names that match those in the Bevis Marks records. Now, this absence of matches is not definitive proof that no Sephardim accessed parish relief, but it does suggest that if they did, it was rare. And I should point out that St. Botolph Aldgate is right at the center of Sephardic settlement in London. The most obvious incentive for Sephardic paupers to choose Old Poor Law relief over the congregation's own system would have been if relief from the parish exceeded that from the congregation. Direct comparisons are difficult to make, but I've calculated the average expenditure on the typical pensioner in the parish of St. Dionis Backchurch and Bevis Marks between 1762 and 1790. For St. Dionis, this came to 2 to 2.5 shillings per week, and for Bevis Marks, 1 shilling and 8 pence. So the difference of 4 to 10 pence per week is not insubstantial, especially for a struggler or a pensioner, but was clearly not enough to tempt the Sephardic poor away. Assuming, of course, that the parishes would have them. Parish vestries were just as keen to maintain the status quo as the Mahamad were. Vestries still collected the poor rate from Jewish ratepayers without having to relieve an additional body of paupers. But even if parish vestries had been keen to take on the Sephardic poor, there were other obstacles in the way of such an option. Only a small minority of the Sephardic poor could prove legal settlement in a parish, which was needed to be able to claim relief. And settlement could only be established through a limited number of conditions. You either had to be born in the parish, serve an apprenticeship in the locality, be hired for a year, hold a local office, pay local tax or rent, or own local property. Quite high bars. Just 10.5% of strugglers in the research period were born in London, while the figure for Mahamad role pensioners was 4.5%, either 4.5 or 14.5. That might be a typo. So even if a Sephardic pauper could prove legal settlement, there was also the deterrent of the workhouse test. This was introduced by an Act of Parliament in 1723 that gave parishes the option of forcing paupers seeking relief to accept being incarcerated in the workhouse. This was the so-called indoor relief as opposed to outdoor relief in the community. By the mid-18th century, most London parishes had invested in accommodation of this type, including parishes with Sephardic populations. The workhouse of St. Mary Whitechapel housed 600 inmates by 1776, another in Christchurch in Spitalfields up to 300. St. Botolph Aldgate operated another large workhouse housing 300 inmates in 1776 on Gravel Lane off Houndsditch. In 1803, this workhouse housed 45% of the parish's permanently relieved poor, meaning that in theory there would have been an almost even chance of a Mahamad roll pensioners who were seeking parish relief would have to have gone into the workhouse. Yet, the register of pauper admissions for the crisis year 1794, for example, contains no identifiable names of Sephardic Jews. This is unsurprising, as any Sephardim entering the workhouse would have undergone a settlement examination, which, as previously noted, has not produced any matches. So they would have had to have met the settlement conditions. A reason often given, not least by Jeremy Bentham in 1778, which prevented Jews from entering workhouses, was that these institutions could not cater for their dietary requirements and observances on Jewish holidays. This is overstated. There is no evidence that Sephardic Jews in any social strata were particularly scrupulous in their religious adherence during the 18th century. In 1767, the elders themselves decried as a scandal and a disgrace that there were many Jews amongst us who publicly break the Sabbath, eat unclean food, and do not attend the synagogue even on solemn festivals. A more significant deterrent than the dietary regime to entering the workhouse would surely have been fear that anti-Jewish sentiment in the general population could translate into physical or verbal violence from the other inmates in the workhouse. Then there would have been the disincentive of the workhouse test itself, which was actually designed to engender incarceration in an institution that only the most desperate would accept. In short, for the minority of Sephardic poor entitled to parish relief, the alternative of outdoor relief by the Mahamad was far more palatable, the disadvantages of the poor law system outweighing the marginal advantage of slightly higher relief levels. In the last 4 decades of the 18th century, the leadership of Bevis Marks was remarkably successful on 2 counts. maintaining a voluntary welfare system in the absence of statutory powers, while still keeping the faithful in its orbit. We've seen that the scale of Sephardic poverty was very high, with a much greater proportion, 61% in receipt of relief, than in the contemporary metropolitan parishes, which was around 8 to 10%. Yet despite this unfavorable social composition, the leaders of the congregation were able to keep relief spending under control. They did this by gradually restricting the criteria for entitlement to groups they regarded as the most vulnerable: widows, orphans, the aged, and the sick and disabled, at the expense of the able-bodied poor. This required a parallel shift in the philosophical underpinnings of welfare from a traditional Jewish one of charity as a right to one more in line with the contemporary Anglo-Protestant ethos behind the old poor laws that had emerged at the time, where entitlement was increasingly based on industriousness and morality. But how cost-effective could the policy be said to have been if its impact were to drive either the poor or wealthier Sephardim away? I've argued that for many of the poor there was no alternative, as they could not establish settlement. Yet even those that were entitled did not apparently seek relief from parish overseers, probably because they were reluctant to submit to the workhouse test widely used in the parishes where Sephardim lived, for various reasons, most of which is that the workhouses were pretty unpleasant places, and also the threat of anti-Semitic behavior towards them. So in this talk so far, I've sought to examine the issue of cohesion, not through the centrifugal forces pushing Sephardim away, but the centripetal forces holding them in: welfare provision, family, and community. Another way of expressing this would be the gravitational pull exerted by the locality. This is not as revelatory as it sounds. The very first article of every iteration of the Ascamot after 1664 explicitly prohibited, quoting here, "duly considering how important is our union," unquote, setting up another Sephardic congregation in London. This was punishable by instant herem, or excommunication. Now, historians argue over the motivation behind this prohibition. Some attribute it to the desire to control income and welfare spending, others to maintain social and political control over the community, so as not to cause scandal to the natives of the city and therefore threaten their position. Whatever the motivation, the effect of the prohibition was to place Bevis Marks at the center of gravity of Sephardic London in a spatial sense. This detail is from Horwood's map of 1799, showing the position of Bevis Marks Synagogue. Now, to zoom out to show that the main effects of the pull of place were on the poor. The revised Ascamot of 1781 dictated that anyone receiving assistance of any kind was obliged to attend synagogue every Sabbath and festival, and on other days of the week as much as possible. Failure to do so without a satisfactory excuse could result in the sanction of the loss of the whole or part of the assistance for 3 months. While the Mahamad might have seen this harsh sanction as an opportunity to instill greater outward observance among the poor, the effect would have been to circumscribe where the poor could live, because they would have had to have been able to travel by foot to the synagogue. To comply, they would have had to reside within walking distance. The poorer, and therefore more affordable parts of the East End were where the poor had been living long since before 1781 anyway, so the effect might be better described as reinforcing existing barriers to spatial mobility. A corollary, however, positive corollary, would have been preserving communal identification and access to kinship networks. Higher up the social scale, Sephardic artisans, small traders, and shopkeepers also preferred to stay within the Aldgate Whitechapel area, attracted by the same community and kinship networks, as well as lower rents. The gravitational pull of the locality on the richest segment, however, was much weaker. The well-documented defections and conversions that accelerated towards the mid-19th century began not among the poor and middling sort in the area near Bevis Marks, but among the heirs of the rich that had grown up outside its orbit. The wealthiest Sephardim had carriages and had been taking up residence away from the Old Gate Whitechapel axis since the end of the 17th century. A scattering acquired country homes on the fringes of London, while a slightly larger concentration could be found in Hackney, a rural hamlet 2.5 miles from Bevis Marks. Some wealthy merchants and brokers maintained a city residence above their offices, or in the elegant new houses on Devonshire Square, seen here. This is today, I think, part of Liverpool Street Station, and Goodman's Fields just to the east. But from 1800, these areas had started to become unfashionable, and affluent Sephardim followed their Christian counterparts to the West End. In 1842, a group of wealthier congregants broke away to set up the reformist West London Synagogue together with some also wealthy Ashkenazim. Eventually, the Mahamad and elders of Bevis Marks allowed the establishment of the first new Sephardic synagogue in West London on Wigmore Street in 1853. The result of this was that the area around Bevis Marks and worship in the synagogue itself was abandoned to the lower strata of the community, which by then was becoming thoroughly mixed through marriage with Ashkenazim. In other words, the union of the congregation was broken. The center unable to hold against the more powerful social forces of acculturation, assimilation, and secularization. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was excellent. As a member of the lower strata of the the community, I should actually say on Friday night I was actually sitting next to a Pinto, so social climbing. I have a couple of questions. The first one never really crossed my mind before, but is giving out matzah, is that actually really going to be a sign of poverty? I mean, for example, today to buy us a box of matzah costs about £2.50. To buy shmura matzah, the really sort of special ones for Passover, cost I think about £10 for 3. I mean, I'm wondering if that is actually a sign of poverty or just more of a communal service. Now, of course, there was also, giving out coal and other stuff as well. But is that a good measure, do you think, of poverty or just lower orders?
Well, I think so. It's the people who were entitled to free matzah were the poor. Finta payers had to pay for the matzah. They weren't given. The only people who were entitled to it were people on relief of some kind, which is our definition of the poor. So, Mahomet pensioners, Bellows pensioners, and strugglers. And you see these lists of people who were given matzah every year. They also included, it has to be said, synagogue officials. So the Hazan, the Haham, various other, and they also received free coal and other perks like that. But it's easy to isolate those because they always come at the top of the list. Everybody below that is our definition of poor. I mean, it's not a random definition, but it is what I would define as poor, or what they defined as poor.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you. When you were talking about Jews receiving money from the parish or the poorhouse, you were saying there were no Sephardic Jews. Were there Ashkenazi Jews?
I think a small number. Okay. Yeah, but the Ashkenazim were much more numerous by this time, towards the end of the 18th century, and therefore it's not surprising to see a few of them there. There were no Jewish workhouses at this time. That came later in the mid-19th century when the Board of Guardians was formed. There was a scheme, the Colquhoun Van Oven scheme envisaged the creation of a Jewish workhouse, but as I sort of explained, it never came to fruition. But no, it's not a mystery, but it's, I think understandable because of the conditions for being able to qualify for poor relief from the parish, which required settlement, and also the fact that that many of these were immigrants and just didn't qualify.
With the rejection of the congregation to join the Kolkun van Oven scheme, you were saying, and obviously this makes a lot of sense, it was, the Kahal didn't want to be subsidizing lots of Ashkenazim. But do you have any evidence at that point that they were still primarily identifying as Portuguese rather than as Jews? Because it's sort of around this time where and you obviously mentioned the reform movement where we're seeing a shift. I'm wondering if we can sort of identify that.
Yeah, it's difficult to say. I mean, the official language of the documents, of the minutes, was still Portuguese. All the minutes are still written in Portuguese, although occasionally you get letters like the one from Jacob Pimentel written in English. Yeah, he was obviously of Portuguese origin from the name, but he was by this time writing in English. So it's a bit of a sort of transition period, the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. But I think there was still this strong communal identification as Portuguese. That's my feeling anyway.
Thank you. And one last question. Isaac de Pinto's pamphlet or book, where can we find copies of that?
Online, I think.
Sorry, I missed that, Tom.
Online, I think.
Yes, it is available online. It is actually on archive.org. This is the Wayback Machine. I think it can be found on archive.org. But did I put that in? We've uploaded it to Transcribus. It's out of copyright, so there's no copyright issues. But I have a feeling I might have uploaded it to our A Nação Hebraica Transcribus account. I don't know if it's been made public, but if it hasn't, I can do that, and you can easily see it from there with a transcription.
Okay, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant presentation, Tom.
Thank you, Ali, for your lively presentation.
Thank
you. Very insightful. I have a question about these parish communities. Were they dominated by the church, or were they civil parishes?
The parish organization, the parishes were part of what are called wards, and wards part of counties. So that was a sort of expanding thing, and it changed over time. But the basic unit was the parish, and these were connected to a particular parish church. So they would have had a vestry, which is a committee, both lay people and clergy, who oversaw the administration of the parish. So things like the overseer of the poor, they would have been co-opted by the vestry to administer poor relief for parishioners.
Okay. In Holland, there was a rule that each denomination had to look after its own poor. That is to say, each church and every synagogue had to look after its own poor. That implied that if Jews wanted to have relief from a church, they had to convert to Christianity. Is there a similar rule in London?
There doesn't seem to have been, and I think you can see this from the opinion of the two jurists, Dunning and the other guy whose name I forget now, who they were very senior law officers, the second and third most senior law officers after the Lord Chancellor in the country, whose opinion was that parishes were obliged to relieve people of all faiths. There was no obligation of the synagogue to relieve its own poor, that this was an entirely voluntary arrangement. Now, the same thing probably also happened in the nonconformist congregations like the Quakers or the Huguenots. And there certainly is evidence in the Huguenot archives as well that they had a similar sort of welfare system that Bevis Marks had for their own people. So people, they didn't want to take part in this parish system, but they could have if they wanted to.
Okay, one last question for me. In the beginning, you said that 40% paid Vinta and 60% of the Portuguese Jews received poor relief. I wonder about that because there must have been those who were too poor to pay Vinta, and there were those who, and at the same time, they were too poor to pay Vinta. So there must have been a small group of people neither paying Vinta nor receiving poor relief. I'm always worried about those because they fall between the cracks of registration. I believe you can find them in the lists of promesas. Someone might not have enough money to pay Vinta, but he could also always pay a small amount of voluntary gifts.
I think it's possible. I think you've hit on a point. I have to confess that I haven't looked at the promesa lists and how well they match the Vinta list. So, but I think looking over a long period of 25, 30 years, presumably some of those people in that kind of narrow band of people at the edge of both categories would be falling in and out of either category. So they'll appear at some stage in one or other of them, either as Vinta payers or as relief, or after a time fall into the other one. So I think you can probably find them over a longer period of time, maybe not in any specific year, but over a longer period of time. That's my guess, but they're I think a fairly small portion anyway, if they do exist.
I think so too. Richard Brett raised his hand. Richard, can you unmute?
Thank you, Ali. Absolutely fascinating talk. I was wondering, for those people that didn't receive any poor relief, how many of them ended up going through the court system? Have you done any research in that area?
You mean to be able to get poor relief from?
No. To as a result of having to resort to criminal activities.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, if they couldn't get any relief elsewhere, they had to resort to crime, and therefore were arrested and going through the court system.
Yeah. No, I've not researched crime and policing in the Sephardic community. There are some very good papers and research that has been carried out on that. I think Todd Endelman's Jews of the Georgian period, his book on that is very good, and Mordecai Rosen as well has written about that, and others. But yeah, I mean, this is that's probably going on at the same time as the things we're talking about. For example, Abby Belasco, the famous boxer, the bare-fisted boxer. He was a publican, fairly respectable. Well, not respectable, but he had a source of income from being a publican. But he and his wife were constantly in and out of the courts. She was charged with running a brothel several times. He was charged with all sorts of criminal offenses, not just grievous bodily harm. So it's a little bit kind of fluid, that area. Yeah, I don't know if that helps, if that answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Brother Miller, can you unmute?
Thank you for that presentation, Ali. Absolutely riveting and full of issues which raise a lot of questions. But you've done a fantastic job there, and I should imagine you've got enough open ends for several lifetimes more research. It strikes me that the bases for comparison with non-Jewish and non-Sephardic communities are really complex, and there are so many variables that it must be really difficult. So congratulations for having come up with some kind of balance. I've got a bunch of questions. The first one is very specific. Early on, when you were talking about the drying up of the direct emigration from Spain and Portugal, you showed a picture. And on the left was a man who had been condemned to death by the Inquisition in Goa. And I wondered whether you had found any evidence of fugitives from the Inquisitions in places other than the Iberian Peninsula, i.e., from India, which is something that I've given talks about in other places before, from the Americas, particularly from South America at the time that the Sephardim were fleeing to North America with the arrival of the Inquisitions in South America. So that's one question. Next question, which is
Bernard, even may interrupt. Let's do one question at a time.
Okay,
Okay.
let me try and answer that.
So
I
some
didn't
people
know that
like
that
to
picture
stick
was
with-
of a victim of the Goa Inquisition, but so thanks for pointing that out. It was just meant to be somebody wearing the the penitent's outfit or with the dragons and the fire and things like that. But yeah, I mean Goa was slightly unusual in that it was an Inquisition set up outside Portugal.
like the Latin American ones.
Well, no, that's the thing. There was no Inquisition set up in Brazil or Suriname or any of these places. They were brought over to Lisbon and Porto, and Lisbon in particular. So the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, had offices in Mexico and I can't remember if it was in Cuba, but certainly in Mexico. But the Portuguese, the only overseas one was in Goa, as far as I'm aware. But no, I'm afraid I haven't looked into that.
No, I wondered because you'd shown that picture whether there had been any evidence of people coming, and they would turn up with Portuguese names.
Yeah.
So it's not as if you would be able to say they've got an Indian name, therefore they're from India. Another question, and it's to do with transatlantic movement. You talked about the dispatchos and the fact that they were basically being offloaded to places that it was thought would be able to accommodate them. But that started sometime after the beginning of Britain transporting people as a punishment. So we got the transportation of criminals, which really grew in the 1770s in Australia, but had been operated transporting criminals to the Americas, particularly Virginia and Maryland, starting around 1610. And I wondered whether or not this was a kind of model that they had drawn on. I mean, it's not like, what Donald Trump describes as the countries exporting their people, their rapists and murderers and inhabitants of insane asylums, but it's possibly not far removed from that. So
Yeah.
could you
Yeah,
say?
I mean, I think dispatcher is slightly different from people being exiled to penal colonies like Australia and Virginia and places like that, because dispatcher was assisted emigration. They were actually given money to go to these places and a certain amount of money, not just for the passage, but also to sort of tide them over for a short period of time until they managed to establish themselves. And this stipulation later on, admittedly, that they had to be of good character, suggests that they weren't sort of sending criminals to these places. My personal hunch is that the group of people that were sent to other Sephardic communities in Europe, like Livorno or Venice or Bordeaux or wherever, were probably of a lower kind of income level. They were the poorest of the immigrants and people who had come from those places in the first place. Whereas the people that were sent to the Americas were, and this is just a hunch, that they were chosen from, I think from amongst the Portuguese rather than the Moriscos and so rather from the Berberiscos and Italians. So and that they were probably people who were most likely to succeed anyway. That it was a kind of positive selection going on there. But that still has to be looked at and proven.
There was a model for the London dispatchers. It was Amsterdam.
Yeah.
Because from its earliest records, which start in 1615, there are mentions of dispatchers.
Yeah.
So it might have been that the Amsterdam model was exported to London. A lot of the Portuguese and Jews in London came from Amsterdam. And you can also see that in the administrative systems they used in London. They look a lot like those in Amsterdam.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that's almost certainly true. That, I mean, you have this early experiment of Brazil when the Dutch conquered part of Portuguese Brazil, and groups of emigres from Amsterdam, from the Portuguese community in Amsterdam, went to Brazil. I believe Manasseh ben Israel was supposed to take a group, but he didn't end up doing it. But others did. And then, of course, they came back. So that was kind of one form of, I suppose, early dispatcher. Then there was another experiment in the 1730s of sending people both from Amsterdam and from London to Georgia in the American colonies. So, there were these things, but it definitely, certainly, it looks to me as it became systematized as De Pinto, Isaac De Pinto was postulating after 1748, because the lists of London dispatchers really start to become explicit as such. Dispatchos para America, Despacho Comuns, which is to the European destinations, from about 1750. So that suggests to me that they adopted this as a policy, a systematic policy from that period. But just on the point that Bernard was making, I think rather than basing the experience on the kind of colonial authorities in England, it was the other way around, that assisted emigration of the poor from Britain, particularly of the Irish poor, really didn't happen until the 1840s. So, this had been going on for nearly 150 years in the Sephardic communities of Amsterdam and London by this point. But it was, in the 1840s that they tried to sort of shovel out the poor, as it was called, and shovel out the poor, of the poor Irish in particular, to the colonies.
Can I ask, was there a kinship element? Because in the earlier records that we've looked at, we see the same family names, but different branches of families being among the dispatchers.
I don't know.
Okay. And I have one other question, which is you mentioned the 1803 Aliens Register and the different professions. That was about the time that quite a lot of jobs were starting to become industrialized, the creation of factories and so on, although most of them were not within the City of London. But I wondered whether there's any evidence of the presence of Sephardim among the early factory workers.
I'm not aware of any. That's not to say it didn't happen, but I think you know, the sort of industries that the Sephardim tended to work in were the tobacco industry, for example.
Which was one that industrialized in the fairly early
Yeah.
19th century.
And maybe sugar refineries as well, which, you know, they definitely existed in the areas, the sugar refineries in the areas that we're talking about. So it's possible, but it wasn't really something that I've come across.
Thanks. A very last question. Were the Uzilis Azulais?
Sorry, say again?
Were the Uzilis Azulais? Because I haven't come across the Uzili name before.
No.
I think more likely Uziel.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. Uzili, there's various, like Uzieli. There are Uzilis in Livorno. You can see there's groups of Uzilis in Livorno, and I'm pretty certain that this family came from Livorno.
Thanks.
Wolfgang.
I don't have 4 questions. I just have one observation, one question. So Ali, really fantastic master's research. What I'd love to comment on is that you and David and the other David, Ton, there's a pedagogy that you are developing or expressing or implementing of multi-factor authentications, you know, based on Sephardic and non-Sephardic. And a list of all of those would be a really important advance to know that we have those kind of cross-validating sources by time and place. That's just pedagogically saying you're doing it, and we ought to call it out and use it as a piece of leverage in the research. The question is, and you hinted at it in the response just before, it seems like the dispatchos have a second or even a third story once they land wherever they're sent to, and whether they, for example, sent money back to Bevis Mark. I don't know, but I'm thinking about the Hebrew Free Loan Societies and how people have been, you know, very gracious in that regard and repaying more than they borrow. Do you see any hope, let's say, for such a life cycle, I don't know, longitudinal thing to see? Were the Sephardim who were sent out thankful in some way?
I think there is evidence that they were. If you look at the wills of Sephardim who died in Barbados or Jamaica who came back to London, some of those were dispatchos. I have come across people who were dispatchos who then came back or who died in those areas, and their wills do leave legacies to, you know, the poor, or for the education of the Sephardic poor, or to Bevis Marks directly, or whatever. So I think, you know, certainly the ones that maintained their connections to the community as Jews did. If they converted, maybe not. But even those might have, you know, it was a lot more fluid than that. So I think that there is some evidence. How widespread it is, I don't know. That's hopefully something I'll be able to figure out. Come back to me in 4 years' time when I finished my PhD.
May you have the strength to do it.
Thank you.
So, okay, last but not least, Frances, can you unmute?
I am unmuted. I've been unmuted for the last half hour. I'm just going to tell you something that I actually did yesterday, which was around the issue of who and what Jews are, and that there are Sephardim. I was at a TUC regional meeting on Friday, and they were talking about race and immigration. And I noticed that nobody had mentioned Jews. Were you there, Bruce? No. I noticed that nobody had mentioned Jews. They were all talking about race and migration. And so I stood up and said, I'm Jewish, and my family came from Egypt and Lithuania. And I knew that they were all assuming that Jews supported Israel. A lot of them were. Some were not, but they were all actually too frightened to talk about Jews. And I explained, and I said quite a bit about it, and about the opposition to what's going on in Israel amongst Jewish people and Jewish groupings. You know, there's support and opposition. I wasn't controversial about it, but it was very clear. And then I heard the sigh of relief go round the room.
Oh.
Yes. And a man behind me said, that was a very good thing to say. No, I know what it makes me think. I do talk about it when I go in. I'm a sort of trade unionist in Equity. I'm a trade unionist in the TUC and on the Race Equality Committee of the TUC. And so I do talk about this. I got onto a Race Equality Committee, and I had to explain that though I wasn't white, I was of another extraction. And they found that very difficult to understand. These are very progressive people, you know, activists. They did not get it. I had to explain the different divisions and issues and things about being Jewish, and it changed them quite a lot. So when I come here, I think, how do we use this stuff, which is exotically beautiful, frightening, rich and complex, to make sure that our actual appearance is diverse and complex as it is. That's all I wanted to say. I really love it if we could think about it, and I might want to talk to people about how I can do a workshop, for example, in the TUC. Whatever. I'll shut up now. Thank you.
No, good point, Francis. I think, you know, the only way we can do this is to tell the stories. You know, we need to tell these stories.
Yes.
Thank you. I would like to point everyone to the chat where Ali put some links in, download links to his dissertation and to his Bevis Marks prosopography. And there are all the names of the poor from the period that he talked about. So I'll give you a few seconds to click on them. And meanwhile, I would like to conclude to thank Ali for his brilliant talk and for the many insights he gave to us into the London poor. As always, we thank our patrons who are with us here. The viewers on YouTube have to wait a week. And in 2 weeks' time, we hope to see you all again when Maarten Hel will talk about Sephardic life in the Jewish neighborhood of Amsterdam, Vlooienburg. He recently wrote a book about Vlooienburg, and he will retell some of his stories. If you missed the links, we'll put them in our newsletter. David?
We will.
Thank you all, and see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent talk. Thank you.